Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash, and today I'm joined by Sai Deepak once again to discuss the latest Pew survey on India, which is titled Religion and Segregation in India, also the state of social sciences in India, and we will also have a sneak preview in his latest book towards the end. So, Sai, welcome to the show.
Namaste, Abhinav. It's a pleasure to be with you. Tell me.
So, Sai, what do you make out of this entire report of the Pew Research Survey? It has come out with very interesting, numbers regarding religious attitudes, caste attitudes, and so on. So, what do you make out of it?
So, my own view about most Pew reports is that, at least with respect to countries of the scale and size of Bharat, I'm not sure of the sample size. Be that as it may, I'm pleasantly surprised that finally there is a report that is coming out from the West, which is closer to Indian reality than most of the reports. Because on the one hand, whenever they visit Bharat, so to speak, there is an Orientalist tendency to celebrate the chaos and the diversity. But whenever they're expected to comment on it, it always has a certain degree of pessimism and negativity associated with it. In stark contrast, this particular report, I think, is a welcome change. And I'm happy that there are quite a few realities that are reflected. Of course, I wouldn't call this the ideal report because there are certain aspects of inability of certain communities to coexist with the other, which perhaps they could have highlighted. But I would say overall, it's a welcome change, it's a welcome improvement, and hopefully more such reports in the future will get more nuanced about the Indian realities with respect to the harmony and coexistence of multiple communities. And I hope they don't end up regurgitating the Ganga Jamuni trope.
So, Sai Deepak, the report tells us that majority of the Indians feel that they are free to practice their religion, and including the minority community. Large number of people say that they respect the people of other religion, and the numbers are 80%, 90% kind of thing. So it's not a small margin. And the majority of the people say that respecting India as a country is a central value of who they are as a religious community. But they also don't want to live together. So they want segregation, right? So they say, we don't want the person of other religion to be my neighbor, but we respect the person. So does it relate to the Indian reality, as you're saying, or what would be the reason that this is the case? From a Western perspective, it's a contradiction, right? You respect, but you want segregation.
Right. It seems like a contradiction from the Western perspective because the West believes in assimilation as a way of life whenever somebody enters their society. I'm not surprised, and I think it's closer to reality because the fact is popular media or mainstream media certainly speaks of Hindu-dominated places and Muslim-dominated spaces whenever it comes to reportage of incidents. So there is a very clear demographic skew when it comes to certain localities. And I would say that holds true of so many cities: Hyderabad, Chennai, Delhi. There are pockets which are specifically limited to certain communities. That's typically been the case. I am not someone who's uncomfortable with it because I believe that typically Bharat as a society has existed in a way that communities which have a similar way of living and have similar mores and values, or perhaps, let's say, even food habits, dietary habits, and whatnot, have lived together. That's been the case. I'm not surprised. Perhaps because of, let's say, a certain degree of Anglicization and exposure to the West, it seems like let's say, an aberration to the urbanized Indian, so to speak. But I think someone who comes from villages or the second-tier cities of the districts, or for that matter, even quite a few cities of this country, it's perfectly normal. I'm certainly not uncomfortable with that particular reality, nor do I see this as something that is out of place with Bharat's civilizational identity.
But when it comes to the caste attitude as well, so you find that almost 82% of the people are saying that they did not feel or they did not face any caste discrimination in the 1 year prior to the survey. Right? And majority of the people, even among the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes, almost 80% say they don't believe there is a widespread discrimination anymore.
Right.
How does it relate to the wider discourse in the country and the other kind of political formations?
I genuinely believe that discrimination is a mixed bag. Okay, it certainly exists, and I wouldn't be the one to actually deny it. I certainly have a problem with the kind of history that is imputed to it, and I may disagree with the historical, let's say, historicity that is associated with it, or at least that is represented in popular discourse. Be that as it may, it exists to some extent, but fortunately, I don't think it exists to the extent to which people would want to believe for their own purposes to perpetuate a certain stereotype about Bharat. Okay, and in that regard, I would believe that the Pew report, again, as I said, is a welcome change because it's fairly closer to this particular reality. Let me relate this to my own experience in schools and other places. I think we've discussed this before, that there used to be a time, at least in my generation, that children were certainly aware of each other's caste identities, perhaps to respect dietary restrictions and other things, at, let's say, during lunch break in schools, but that would never translate to choosing your friends based on caste. Okay, that has never been the case. Okay, or let's say friends coming over to your place or you going to their place certainly never had anything to do with each other's caste. And I can confidently say this, and I'm not going to repeat this cliche that I have friends across all castes. That is the reality across the country, according to me, that most Indians are actually like that. And this is not with respect to the generation after my generation, which is to say the kids of the 2000s and subsequently. In the 90s, this used to be the case in schools and other places. In fact, caste as an identity would not be relevant, but its existence would certainly not be ignored, so to speak. Okay, nobody would be uncomfortable discussing certain aspects. Okay, so I certainly believe that perhaps these are aspects which India is now beginning to understand, thanks to a report that has come from the outside. Then this has been its lived experience all along. Okay, so I certainly believe that maybe we need a greater and a much more transparent discussion with respect to caste-related aspects, apart from the history of it, generally as to how has it actually affected our interpersonal relationships on a day-to-day basis. That is something that we rarely touch upon because it typically goes to the Shastras, it goes to temples, it goes to marriages. But social conduct and social transactions beyond these established, or let's say the typical go-to points of discussion, has not happened enough. I don't think anybody in the Hindu society, largely speaking, has decided to establish relationships primarily on the basis of caste when it comes to social transactions. It's either on the basis of convenience, on the basis of economic necessity, or plain and simple human bonding. And this is the interesting aspect. Notwithstanding the fact that certain caste groups may live in their own spaces, so to speak, in their own localities, so to speak, that has not had a bearing on their ability to interact with members of the other caste. That's the interesting aspect. So not only does it function within the Hindu society, within a particular community, that equally extends itself to interreligious transactions as well, to a significant extent. I don't wish to paint a romantic picture of interreligious harmony in this particular country. Be that as it may, I'm merely saying, given that a significant number of people who belong to religious minorities come from a same background for the reasons that they were converted either because of inducement or because of forced conversion, there are certain practices that they have taken forward even with respect to the manner in which they interact with other groups. Okay. So when someone tells me that there is something called an Indian version of Islam or an Indian version of Christianity, I'd say, I'm so sorry to say that's not true, because these people have been forced to convert to a different religion and they've not been able to let go of the culture of their ancestors. They're taking their ancestral cultural practices to the new cultural milieu, the new cultural, let's say, religious landscape, so to speak. Okay, so it's not as if Islam has suddenly adapted itself to Bharat or Christianity has suddenly adapted itself to Bharat. These are adaptations that human beings are forced to undergo for the simple reason that they've been pushed into a new environment altogether for different for reasons which are well known in public.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, if you look at this entire talk, that before the modern period, the Hindu and the Muslims were living together peacefully, but that's debatable. Right. That's not true. But in the villages, certainly you did not see much of the communal tension because the caste identities were stronger than the religious identity. So no one would say that he's a Hindu or a Muslim. They say that Julaha, he's a Brahmin, he's a Jat, or he's a Ansari or something like that. But the research also says certain things. Like it says that majority of the people in India socialize within their own community and caste. So significant number of people have friends exclusively from their own caste group, which is opposite to what you were saying. In the school, you had the people of different communities.
Right.
I think, is it happening because when you are at school, you are in a very closed environment? The moment you start graduating and become part of the mainstream society, you get socialized in certain way. So that is there. How do you see that? Second point, majority of the people, whether it's Hindus or Muslims, Sikhs or Jain, don't want interreligious marriages.
Right.
So it's not that the BJP is doing that. It's not that some political party is doing that.
Correct.
It's the people don't want it.
Right.
So why do our, let's say, activist class or the liberal class fails to understand there is no acceptability of interreligious marriages?
So let's first unpack the first question itself. If you go to a country like America, I'm surprised that people don't realize that Hispanics as a group have certain group decisions, have certain identities. Or let's say the African Americans have certain considerations when it comes to interactions and transactions outside their community for reasons which may be well founded. Now, similarly, when it comes to Bharat, the markers of identity and the layers of identity may change, but the tendency to try and socialize within the community hasn't changed much, and it need not change much also, according to me. See, the point is clannishness, and I wouldn't use the word tribalism here, and nor would I call the word or use the word clannish in a pejorative sense. I'm merely saying it is human tendency to try and move with people who have a certain shared sense of, let's say, day-to-day transactions or day-to-day cultural mores, so to speak, because at the end of the day, the linguistic dialect also changes depending on the caste, by the way. So if you happen to be a Tamilian, language changes from caste to a significant degree. That is a fact. The same language has different dialects and different dictions and different styles of pronunciation. So for instance, if you happen to be a Tamilian, if someone calls Swami as Swami, and if someone were to use the word Sami for Swami, then you clearly know that they come from two different communities. Okay, so Kumaraswamy and Kumar Sami would be two different people altogether, and they come from two different communities altogether. That's how it works. Okay, so I'm certainly of the view that either endogamous transactions, for the lack of a better word, endogamous transactions is not something that people need to frown upon. The Lutyens class, so to speak, and I use this to represent a certain mindset which is prevalent in most elite spaces across the country, not just in Delhi, is unable to actually relate to this for the simple reason that they have grown up in certain cocoons, certain bubbles, so to speak, which are completely cut off from the realities of Bharat. And those realities of Bharat that they have not been exposed to, according to them, are signs of regression and retrogression, okay, which I certainly don't agree with. So I will not judge the lived experience and the cultural experience of these communities and these groups and these cross-sections of the society using the prism of the elite wine tasting communities of let's say, Delhi or other places. Point number two, outside of the school, for that matter, the only major transaction which necessarily brings in the caste element is marriage. Okay, let's be clear. Any number of startup ventures in the 90s and the 2000s, take a look at the number of people and the groups which have started it. I would struggle to actually come to the conclusion that these ventures have been set up by people who come from a similar background and typically from the same caste background. That wouldn't be the case at all. Because you see, at the end of the day, economics also plays a significant role in the decisions that people take beyond culture. I wouldn't necessarily be in a position to attribute the kind of proportion that one has to give to economics and culture to understand which influences a certain decision to what extent, but both play a significant role. Okay, so the only major transaction where this becomes a huge consideration is marriage. And if I may say so, at the expense of sounding toxic and whatnot, let me go a step further. Why is it that when it comes to marriage, intercaste marriage, even in 2021, is not exactly the norm? There's a reason for it. I'm not justifying it. I'm merely stating facts for what they are. Point number one, because it has a bearing on food habits. It has a bearing on day-to-day functions. Okay, it has a bearing on every ceremony and every, let's say, religious practice that is observed. I'll give you a straightforward example. Since I come from the much reviled Savarna community, which is the Tamil Brahmin community, okay, even between Tamil Brahmins, even among Tamil Brahmins, so to speak, like any other community, there are multiple sects. Okay, so the practices vary between sects from within the Shaivites and within the Vaishnavites. Okay, not to speak of the difference between the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites. Okay, from naming of the child to whatnot, the manner in which the marriage is conducted, everything changes. Therefore, you are effectively asking at least one partner in the relationship, and not just the partner, but the family associated with that partner, to adopt or give up a certain way of life that they believe in. For some people, it may be easy. For most, it may not be. Okay, so I don't see this as a function of how open-minded or narrow-minded they are. It's simply a function of how associated or attached they are to their own roots. Me being attached to my roots is certainly not a sign of me being closed-minded. Okay, assuming for a moment that there is a certain sentiment that prevails over all these attachments and all these connections, which is to say love, so to speak, and therefore you decide to take a certain transaction, then that's a different issue altogether. Okay, but otherwise, you try and look for fits which fit well and which fit easily and smoothly without calling for too much of a change on the part of both families. Because even today, marriage, notwithstanding the fact that it's a transaction, and in our case, it happens to be a holy transaction between two people, is not just between two people, but it's between two families. And families would effectively bring in the community angle. So I don't think that's an easy situation at all. What was the second layer of your question, please?
No, I was asking about that Hindus and Muslims and different religions do not accept interreligious marriage. So it's a very clear-cut number we don't want.
Correct. So on the interreligious marriage, I certainly believe that there are, apart from historical reasons, there are very clear religious reasons. That much is clear. And now with the increasing skew in the manner in which the property distribution may happen, depending on who gets married to whom and where the girl comes from or where the boy comes from, obviously there are multiple considerations at play. And dare I say this, given the increasing number of reports with respect to grooming instances and grooming jihad, so to speak, I would certainly consider it justified wariness on the part of families before they enter into marital relationships with people coming from other communities. That's a justified consideration. And the reason why I say that increasing reports coming out, because I believe that this has been under the radar for quite some time. It's being reported for the very first time in such an open and transparent manner. So it's not as if it's a new reality or a new development. This has been going on for decades. It has suddenly come to light because of, let's say, people beginning to speak up, or when they've realized that Pani sar ke upar se nikal chuka hai, now it's time for us to start speaking about it. Okay. So interreligious marriages and the kind of interreligious harmony that people want to celebrate, I'm sorry to say, barring certain islands or for caste-based reasons, I don't believe it has ever existed in Bharat. Simply because if there is a certain sentiment or a certain mindset that fundamentally believes that your existence is an abomination on human history and on, let's say, they believe that you don't have a right to exist, then I don't see how it's possible to enjoy a harmonious relationship or much less enter into a marital relationship with them. That's something that's humbug that I am not interested in buying. That's hogwash, complete hogwash.
Yeah. But, coming to this report, and this report is perhaps for the first time we have such an empirical data, which completely destroys the narrative which has been going on against India in the last 6-7 years, both in the media and the academia, especially in the West. But why do you think our social sciences have failed to present a picture of the reality? Why our social sciences are completely dominated by the West? I have, had interviewed this very interesting person, Alexei Arora, on my podcast.
Okay.
And he's the one whom I describe as the Hindu left. He also makes the same point, that Indian elites, Indian education is completely dominated by American universities.
Right.
Why do you think that is the case?
So I think it goes back to the introduction of Western education as well as English education significantly. And anybody who assumes that English education has got nothing to do with transmission of culture, one misses out the complete intention behind the introduction of English education, which was to effectively westernize and bring in Christian notions of civilization and culture and community and whatnot to the heathen population, which was, according to them, wallowing in the sea of darkness, which is Hinduism. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, effectively, the West has become the aspirational ideal towards which our entire social mobility is geared towards. Okay. And as a consequence of which, India has become the launchpad for everything in every sense, not just for careers, but also for progression in a cultural sense, in a social sense, in perhaps a religious sense. Okay. As a consequence of which, I believe that in general, regardless of the reality of hijack of academic institutions and educational institutions and policies by the Nehruvian Marxist clique, so to speak, independent of that also, because the Nehruvian Marxist clique is a relatively recent introduction in Bharat's history. You're looking at the period from the 50s. But I'm talking of the period from the 1830s, which started with the introduction of English education in this country. Okay, so the foundation for this particular movement was laid in the colonial era, but it was taken to its logical conclusion, according to me, through this convenient vehicle called Marxism, which has effectively pushed this even further. So the disparity that exists, or the, let's say, the dichotomy that exists between academic notions of India and the reality of Bharat is to be significantly attributed to the fact that the humanities department and the social sciences department have been the exclusive preserve of a certain specific ideology, which has always been, I would say, antagonistic and has not enjoyed the best of relationships with the Indic consciousness, which has a very clear animus and problem with the native consciousness. So I am not surprised at the manner in which they represent us as a society. They may be Indians for the purposes of legality, for the purposes of a legal marker or identity, but in their mind, they are clearly operating out of a different jurisdiction altogether, a different mind space altogether. They subscribe to certain notions which have absolutely no basis in any school of philosophy or thought or way of life as far as Bharat is concerned.
Mm. Yeah, so we have been seeing this research coming out of institutes like Tata Institute of Social Science,
Right.
Whether it's gender studies, whether it's peace and conflict studies, whether it's student development, same homogeneous propaganda when it comes to territorial integrity of India.
Right.
It seems that they are directly publishing the pamphlets of Hizbul Mujahideen and Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Correct.
And this is often justified as academic freedom.
Right.
The government is trying to say that why your thesis is titled India Occupied Kashmir, that becomes the question of academic freedom, freedom of expression, and so on.
Right.
How do you think that we should be dealing with this problem? Is there a legal remedy for this thing, or is something else?
I would actually go to the extent of calling such institutions rogue institutions, and I wouldn't beat around the bush on that particular issue. These are rogue institutions, I repeat, and must be dealt with as seditious entities. 100% they must be dealt with as seditious entities. I'm sure that there may be maybe 20 to 30% individuals and students who don't subscribe to the notions that the organization subscribes to. Because I've interacted with students from TISS, especially in the aftermath of the dilution of Article 370 and the promulgation of the CAA, the kind of haranguing and the kind of bullying that supporters of both these developments were subjected to by students and faculty. I'm very clear that it's not possible to say that all students in these institutions necessarily subscribe to the particular point of view. But the institution certainly has a slant which has been pampered, mollycoddled, and indulged in by the Nehruvian dispensation. And when I say the Nehruvian dispensation, I typically mean the Congress dispensation right into 2004, okay, or rather 2014. So these institutions, one, an ultimatum must certainly be set up. And I don't think we should indulge them beyond a certain point, because these people are creating the policymakers of the future, the educators of the future, and the people who are going to sit in institutions and organizations like the UGC and God knows what else. Okay, they are the ones who are going to decide pedagogy, curricula, and everything under the sun. Therefore, the aura of respectability that they cover themselves with must be completely pulled off to reveal what they are, which is that they are anti-Indian institutions which are completely hell-bent on creating an atmosphere where people stop respecting their country and people start looking at their own country as a colonizer, as a colonizing entity, so to speak. Imagine the victims of colonization being accused of colonization, okay? And in a sense, tomorrow we'll be told that Kerala is a separate entity altogether and the Indian Union colonized Kerala. Therefore,
they already say it, by the way.
Exactly, because the integration of this country by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, according to them, translates to colonization.
Yeah.
Okay. So the creation of Bharat as an entity is the creation of a colonizing entity, according to them. If this is the reading of Bharat's history, I see no reason to indulge them in the name of academic freedom at all. What is this academic freedom that comes at the expense of my future? What is this academic freedom that comes at the expense of my existence? It's an existential threat. These are existential threats. Be it JNU or TISS or certain private universities, which are better known as private JNUs, these institutions must certainly be reined in. Unfortunately, the government seems to be incapable of reining in either an entity like Twitter or academic institutions, one in the name of free speech and the other in the name of academic freedom. So perhaps the Indian government must stop resorting to its most favorite tactic, which is saber rattling, and actually use the saber wherever possible. Okay, because there is a point beyond which the fear of God must be induced in these institutions, and they must know that there will be repercussions for doing this, not just in terms of finances, but penal consequences and criminal consequences. They must be blacklisted, no state grants, no state funds, and it must be made difficult for them to have access to any kind of students or faculty recruitment. I would simply go to the extent of saying that their lives must be made miserable for the simple reason that this is the only language that the left understands. This is the only language that the Marxist understands. Power is the only language that this particular group understands. And I would certainly think nothing of media consequences or international consequences, because honestly speaking, किसने क्या बिगाड़ लिया चाइना का, किसने क्या बिगाड़ लिया रशिया का? Nobody's been able to do anything to any of these institutions for that matter. The instinct to preserve the nation, or the instinct to preserve the state, according to me, is the supreme self-interest under which I would certainly justify these activities, because it creates a problem for public order. And there are constitutional reasons for doing this. Forget sedition for a moment. If this particular curriculum and this kind of report does not threaten the integrity of the state, I don't understand what else is, because the stupid argument that's going to be given to us is, until somebody fires a bullet or picks up the gun, tolerate everything that he does until that particular step. Because picking up the gun or picking up the weapon against the step is the culmination of everything that happens until then.
Yes.
Therefore, indoctrination and brainwashing that happens until that particular stage, according to me, is the actual cause. Picking up the gun is the effect. So to be told that wait for the effect to take effect is, according to me, rank stupidity. I don't need to wait for that. And we have tolerated this for so many generations now.
Yeah, I agree. So the academic freedom basically means homogeneous propaganda, and the critical thinking means publishing pamphlets of ISPR and Hizbul Mujahideen.
Correct.
And dissent simply means for these people silencing any other diverse voice. But you mentioned China, and China is another country which is a civilizational state just like India.
Right.
Do you think liberal democracy has failed and Chinese model is the way forward, some variant of Chinese model?
So
that's a question which lots of people are asking around the world today.
Right. I don't think the choice is between a liberal democracy and a Chinese model. So before that, let me address one point. A civilization state and a state which presides over a civilization are two different things. Okay, because a civilizational state behaves as a state with the conscious knowledge that it presides over a civilization and formulates policies accordingly. The Indian state doesn't behave like a civilizational state even one bit. The fact that it presides over a society doesn't make it a civilizational state. Whereas China clearly believes that it is a civilization and is clear about expanding that particular vision and acting on that particular vision. Therefore, between the two countries, China is the better country that fits the definition of a civilizational state. That's point number one. Point number two, only a weak democracy is forced to look at China as an option, or a weak state is forced to look at China as an option. Okay? If you act as a state which has the guts to act on the written letter of the law and to enforce it in the interest of preserving your integrity, you wouldn't have to look at China as an option. Okay? This impotent rage that India is filled with is the reason why it is now forced to consider extreme options. Okay? I have to ask myself a simple question. न्याय विधान में कुछ चेंज करने की जरूरत है, प्रणाली में कुछ चेंज करने की जरूरत है, या अमल करने में या एग्जीक्यूशन में चेंज करने की जरूरत है? Is the simple question. So India, according to me, has enough laws to protect all its interests, by and large, so to speak. The question is of the political will to implement the black letter of the law, regardless of the so-called repercussions from the media and the liberal left elite. Okay? Why liberal left? It's illiberal left elite. Okay? So I don't wish to subscribe to the notion that the concept of a democracy and the concept of a non-Chinese model is out on its way. No, it is not. It is possible because take a look at France today. Are you telling me that Macron is necessarily subscribing to a Chinese model to be able to do what he wants to? Not at all. He stays within the four corners of democracy and still continues to be able to deliver the goods because he has the ability to speak the truth and at least preserve what he believes are the values of the Enlightenment. Of course, I don't subscribe to the values of the Enlightenment, but France does. It knows what are its founding values and principles. And it is very clear that those who can't subscribe to these values are not welcome. Whether you're citizens or not doesn't make a difference, period. Mm-hmm. So that is a model that is certainly worth looking at.
That brings us to your latest book, and that's your first book, right?
Right.
India That is Bharat. What this book is all about, and first of all, if I may ask, what is the cover all about? That's a very intriguing cover out there.
So I had a slightly different cover in mind, but as we kept working, we arrived at this particular cover. So there are three things. The color blue has been typically associated with Bharat apart from saffron. Okay. So when a gentleman asked Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, what is the color of infinity? Radhakrishnan, as a child, ended up saying blue. Okay. And the person asking him the question, I believe I read this somewhere, was Swami Vivekananda. Okay. So therefore, blue has a very clear itihasic and Puranic connotation. Okay. We typically associate saffron with Hinduism and Dharma, but blue is equally a color that is to be associated with Dharma, according to me. Which is why whenever you see representations in idols or in vigrahas, and let's say in Amachitra Katha and other places, our characters are effectively shown in blue, be it Arjuna, Krishna, Rama, so on. Okay. Of course, they are dark, but they're still shown as blue. Two, in terms of India, that is Bharat, that is a direct lift from Article 1. So when the CAA was being discussed and debated, and I referred to India as Bharat on Twitter, an Indian engineering student doing his master's in America accused me of bigotry for having used Bharat for India. Okay, saying Bharat is saffron agenda and Hindutva agenda. And when I reproduced Article 1 and I said this is the response, and therefore if you're a constitutional patriot, this is what the Constitution says, he immediately deleted his tweet and he blocked me. Okay, so the kind of stupidity that is present in the minds of, let's say, certain demographics, so to speak, because of what they've been taught. I don't completely blame them, but because of what they've been taught and what they've been brainwashed into believing, I wanted to address that. Three, I wanted to show a continuing tussle and therefore the battle scene. Okay, colonization may have ended, decolonization may have taken place, but coloniality continues, which means that mindset continues, and now it is the battle for the mind space. Okay, which according to me is the most important battlefield. And therefore I chose the subtitle, Coloniality, Civilization and Constitution. In fact, I got a recent feedback saying, why didn't you make it Civilization, Coloniality and Constitution? I said, no, I'm merely looking at civilization being sandwiched between coloniality and constitution. Okay. And therefore, I wanted to understand what is this relationship between, let's say, the factum of colonization and what governs today, which is Bharat's new religion, which is constitution. Okay. And the subtitle effectively also translates to the structure of the book. The book has 3 sections. The first one deals with the history of colonization, but most importantly, the mindset behind colonization and therefore coloniality. It covers the period between the age of discovery, 1492, and almost until 1989, the end of Cold War. Okay, covering the broad period and the emergence of this particular school of thought. Followed by Bharat's experience with colonization, European colonization, and most importantly, the impact of colonization on 5 different markers of Bharat's consciousness. What we now consider religion. 2nd, nature. 3, language. 4, caste. 5, tribe. Okay. Now, because I'm not a subject matter expert, I have not delved deep into each of these aspects, but I have certainly managed to show the impact of colonial consciousness on each of these things, using expert literature and using the literature already existing. Okay. The third aspect is where I cover the period between 31st of December 1600 to the passing of the Government of India Act of 1919. 31st of December 1600 was when the East India Company was founded. Okay. that is when the first charter was actually issued, the London Company, so to speak.
Yeah.
So from there to 1919, the journey from being ruled by the company to the crown, and ultimately by the British-made Constitution of Government of India Act of 1919, is what I deal with.
Okay.
And what was the civilizing tendency or the colonizing tendency which informed the Government of India Act of 1919? So this is the broad schema and structure of the book.
Oh, that's interesting. So,
And I reproduce a lot of legislative material. First,
so basically, you have said that this is the first book in a series, right? So,
yes.
did you already decide what will be the books be about?
Yes.
What time frame will they be dealing with?
Yes. So in fact, in the introduction to the book, I have clearly given readers the scope of this book and the timeline that this covers, as well as what is the timeline that the first sequel and the second sequel will cover. So I call this the Bharat trilogy. So this particular book ends in the period of 1919-1920, which is the period where three things happen. The First World War ends. The Treaty of Versailles is actually entered into based on the Paris Peace Conference, which also leads to the founding of the League of Nations and the impact of that on the Government of India Act of 1919. I cover all of that. Okay. There's a direct impact which I have placed based on direct.
That is new to me. I never thought about this link.
Exactly, because most people, let's say, rely on secondary propositions, which is why I've directly gone to the debates themselves where there is a direct reference to each of these aspects. Okay. Then the second book will cover the period between 1920 to 1951, where I look at the movement towards the 1935 Act, then the 1947 government of, the Constitution. Therefore, the Constituent Assembly debates everything. 1951, because that's when the first amendment to the Constitution was effected, which is when freedom of speech was curtailed by Nehru, ably aided by Dr. Ambedkar. Okay. Then 1952 to at least 1977 will be the subject of the third book. But I'm hoping to go well beyond 1977. The idea is to cover Indira Gandhi's period and much beyond that as well. So the books are expected to come back to back. That is, this year is this book, the next year will be the next book, and the third year will be the third book.
Okay, interesting. I mean, that's a lot to look forward to. But I heard that certain people are quite angry about your first book and they're planning to burn it, apparently. Who are these people?
In certain elite law schools based out of Delhi, especially after the positions that I took with respect to Article 370 and CAA and other issues, supported by certain, let's say, senior members of the fraternity, they have decided to create what is known as the Hate Sai Deepak Club. Okay. And apparently there are certain WhatsApp groups with this name. Okay. And fortunately, there is enough resistance to them on the campus itself from other people who seem to support my positions. Okay. So at the very least, I'm happy that a churn has started and it's no more one-sided where one particular entity or one particular school of thought bullies the other into silencing. Okay. So they have been tasked with the exercise of ordering copies of my book in huge numbers only to burn it. Okay. So
good for the publisher, good for you.
I said, do it. Fantastic. And what more do I need to prove that your mindset is no different from the Nazi mindset? Both of them believed in burning books. And I'm happy to note that, and the best part is the moment they did that, there were very clear, intelligent reactions from the other side to say, you've not just proved a point that you're fundamentally fascists who pass off as liberals. So that must have riled them up a bit. I'm very, very happy that this is happening for the simple reason that this is the exact kind of churn that I thought the book should effectively initiate and trigger. Good.
So your book is going to be the one which is going to have the most dramatic launch, the book burning. So looking forward to it. I hope they share the videos as well. But Sai Deepak, thanks for your time. Thanks for coming to the show and discussing these aspects. A very best wishes for your future books as well. I think this book is already a big hit, right? It's getting in the top spot.
So I'm grateful for this opportunity. And once the book is out, I would certainly love to hear your views and maybe we could discuss it in the future.
Oh, definitely. Looking forward to it. And thanks a lot. Thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please subscribe to the channel. And you can also join the channel to support the channel. Thank you and see you soon.